So what I wanted to do in this video was respond to an idea that I read about on the Hockey Writers. Now, this is a really strange idea, but it's one that I think actually does bear some significance if you're a fan of the Detroit Red Wings. Now, I wanted to turn your attention to this article by Devin Little from earlier yesterday. Red Wings, 5 things we have learned about Steve Yzerman. As to how Stevie Y, the GM of the Detroit Red Wings, has done his job so far. And there are 5 different things that are talked about in this piece, but I really wanted to only focus on one of them. Because some of the others, I think, they're pretty unanimously agreeable, and I think it wouldn't really be too much of a conversation to bring them up, because it's like, okay, yeah, like, that's true. But I wanted to talk in particular about one of the points that I thought was maybe a little bit more contentious than the others. Without further ado, let's go out there and read this piece. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read more and have the extra 4 things that we have learned about Yzerman brought onto your computer screens. But for now, let's go out there and read the intro. On April 19, 2019, the Detroit Red Wings hired Steve Yzerman as their GM. Fans were, of course, familiar with Yzerman from his days as a player and the team's captain. But the Tampa Bay Lightning is where he had cut his chops as a GM. Now that his tenure in Detroit has reached 5 years, we can start to draw some conclusions about who he is as a GM and how he approaches the job. Let's skip past number 1 and not talk about 3, 4, and 5, but instead focus on thing number 2. Steve Yzerman over-ripens his prospects. Now that's a pretty great word. Over-ripens. What does that mean? Let's go over onto Google and read the entire definition here. Over-ripen. Passed beyond maturity or ripeness towards decay. An overripe pear, quote unquote. Steve Yzerman may have replaced Ken Holland as a GM back in 2018, but some might have forgotten that Ken Holland was Yzerman's mentor in the latter's early days as an executive in the NHL. Under Ken Holland's tutelage, Steve Yzerman learned how to negotiate contracts, work out trades with his colleagues across the league, and how to manage a front office. But there is perhaps no clearer sign that Holland was Yzerman's mentor than how the latter manages the prospects he drafts. Longtime Red Wings fans are likely familiar with the term overripe when it comes to prospects. The term refers to prospects that are ready for the NHL and have been for a while. It has long been Ken Holland's philosophy that organizations should not only refrain from forcing their youngest players to the NHL, but they should also wait until those prospects are clearly ahead of their peers playing in the AHL and other leagues around the world. From what we have seen out of Steve Yzerman to this point in his tenure, he shares a similar outlook on how to develop and manage prospects. As previously mentioned, Moritz Seider, 2019 6th overall, and Raymond, 2020 4th overall, are the only Yzerman draft picks that have become full-time Wings to this point in Yzerman's tenure. Both of them made their debuts in 21-22, and Yzerman has been pretty vocal about how he originally expected Raymond to at least start that season in the AHL. Since that season, however, the Wings have not had a single rookie crack the opening night roster, excluding Elmer Soderblom, who had made the opening night roster in 22-23 before he was reassigned to the AHL a month later. Steve Yzerman's patience with the Red Wings prospects came to a head during the 23-24 season when 2 players, Jonathan Berggren and Simon Edvinsson, were left off the NHL roster for most of the season despite looking NHL ready the prior year. Berggren, a second-round pick in Holland's last draft with the Wings, played in 67 games with the Wings in 22-23 and had spurts where he was Detroit's most creative player on the ice. Edvinsson, the Wings' top pick in 2021, looked ready to go after a 9-game audition late in 22-23, but was instead tasked with another season atop the Grand Rapids Griffins defensive chart in the AHL. This fact is something to keep in mind, especially with the growing expectation that a number of prospects could push for a role in Detroit this season. Yzerman has made it clear that he doesn't just want his prospects to play in the NHL, he wants them to thrive and play meaningful minutes when they arrive. He may not use the term overripe, but it is clear that the concept is something Holland passed on to Yzerman. Now that is the end of this second thing as written about in the 5 things we learned about Stevie Y article by Devin Little. The rest is going to be in the description if you want to go ahead and read it, but I really like this conversation because there are 2 sides that you could attack this perspective from. Firstly, you could say, hey, Stevie Y just kind of hasn't built a team where players like these are really necessary. You can talk about Jonathan Berggren and whether or not he should have been a Detroit Red Wing heading into the most previously completed season, but when you think about some of the other guys that are already on the squad, or the other players that Steve Yzerman acquired, there was already a few of these top 6 forwards. You added on Andrew Kopp, you added on JT Compher, you still had some of the guys who were depth players. The point is, you could realistically debate that for Jonathan Berggren, it may not have been a subject of whether or not he was good enough to play in the NHL, it's whether or not he may have been good enough to dethrone some of the guys that were already there. Say what you want about Daniel Sprong, his lack of defensive play, but he was an effective goal scorer. Say what you want about Christian Fischer's lack of offensive production, but he was a very hard worker. And the question is whether or not Jonathan Berggren would really have excelled in any of those spots in that part of the lineup. He's not dethroning an Andrew Kopp. Sorry, you may think that he's a better player than Kopp, but monetary amounts and coach usage speak differently than that. Now, as for Simon Edvinsson, you could debate that his skill set was a lot more, let's just say, translatable to positive play this previous season than you could have expected out of guys like Ben Sherratt or Jeff Petrie or whomever else, but same thing applies there. These other guys are making so much money, it would be kind of very foolish optically to bring these guys on and then immediately thrust them into the AHL. And you could say that there are some other names that could have been tossed around as potential scratch material to give Edvinsson an opportunity, but it seems more so like the Wings were attacking this previous season from the perspective that said, hey, we don't want to rely on these guys. They're there and they have the potential of playing games, and that's what both of them, Berggren and Edvinsson, did. But it seems like Yzerman is more so building a team that didn't want to rely on that right away. And so when I think about the quality of the prospects that the Red Wings have drafted, especially when Yzerman came in, of course, there's only 2 guys that I could say are definitive NHL talents, Raymond and Seider. But everybody else, I mean, I could totally understand why Marco Kasper is not in the NHL yet. I can totally understand why Nate Danielson isn't there yet. I can totally understand that from the perspective of what they're building, a lot of these guys might just take a little bit of extra time. And even though you can say that a Simon Edvinsson might be taking a little bit too much time, the fact is his cup of coffee was there, and I don't necessarily think that it's Yzerman being stingy and saying, oh yeah, no, we don't want to bring our guys into the NHL yet. We are just uncomfortable with him being there. We don't think he's ready. No, it's not that. It's just, I don't think the Wings put themselves in a position where they needed these guys to be ready. That seems to be the team that Yzerman has built up to this point. A transitory, competitive team that's not going to be a bottom feeder for this entire time. Sure, they were bottom feeders when Raymond and Edvinsson were drafted, but they're kind of transitioning away from that now. They want to be competitive, they want to give Larkin something to work for, and relying on younger guys just doesn't seem to be a part of that plan. And maybe in a way, I'm just rephrasing what it is the article brought up, but I am kind of defending Yzerman's honor a little bit by also talking about how when Ken Holland did this stuff, it was like blatantly obvious that that was the plan. I mean, for Dylan Larkin, we could all talk about him when he made his NHL debut. I remember in the 2015-16 season preview video for TSN, I remember Craig Button talking about Dylan Larkin in the same category as Connor McDavid and Jack Eichel. Like, oh, these are the 3 guys. These are going to be competitive guys, all competing for the Calder. They're going to be top centers on their teams soon. And to Button's credit, they all did do that. It's just that Larkin didn't really do that to the same magnitude as McDavid and Eichel, but throughout those Holland days, I also feel like the Red Wings didn't really need to get their prospects immediately thrusted into the lineup because at the same time, in that time frame, they were competitive already. So, in a way, I think this argument does make sense, but I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing, nor do I necessarily think that it needs to change, you know? You're free to disagree whenever you want, of course. The comments section is your floor. What are your opinions about guys like Marco Kasper, Nate Danielson, Axel Sandin-Pellikka, Simon Edvinsson, Jonathan Berggren, and every other prospect drafted from 2020 up until now not being a full-time Red Wing? And do you think this is Steve Yzerman, quote-unquote, over-ripening his prospects in his system? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.